Good morning, everybody. So, not everybody's here in the room. We've got a few people joining us remotely. My name is James MacKenzie, and I'm the Director of Scholarly Technologies here at UNB. Actually, no, that's not right. I'm the Director of Advanced Digital Research and Scholarship here at UNB Library. And pleased to welcome you all here today for Summer Research Booster. Really what we're aiming to do today is just to give everybody a little bit of a taste of some of the services that are available here at the library, some things that you might not necessarily have associated us with. But we do want to let you know that we are here. It's also an opportunity for us to give you the chance to put some names to faces to services that we offer here at the library too. Not all of our instructors are here today, but I was hoping we would do just a quick round of introductions. I'll introduce myself. Mike is here with me, and since not everybody is here in the room, maybe I'll ask those of you that are instructing, because we are going to explain the layout for the day. We are going to be spending a little bit of time in separate rooms, so just to make sure that you get a chance as much as possible to know everybody who's going to be in the room. First of all, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Hey, I'm Mike Nason, Scholarly Communications and Publishing Librarian.
And Julie?
Hi, I am the Collections Analysis and Bibliometrics Librarian.
Richelle?
Richelle Witherspoon. I'm the Health Librarian, and I'll be talking about systematic reviews and knowledge synthesis.
Marc?
Hello.
I'm Marc Bragdon, working the camera, and I'm the head of the Research Commons as well as the liaison librarian for the Faculty of Education.
All right. We won't waste any time before we get started. I will explain just a little bit about what we're going to be doing. We're going to be all together in the same space room for the first part of the morning. To hand things off to Mike, he's going to talk about persistent identifiers. And then Marc is going to walk us through some new text that we have available here at the library too, for presentations and instructions. And then for the second half of the morning, we're going to split into two separate streams, essentially. We're going to put things down basically into 20-minute presentations. So if at some point you'd like to switch between streams to move between rooms, there is a program here so you know what's coming up for you in the second half. Before we break into the second half of the morning, for those of you that are joining us remotely, I'm going to send a separate link for the second half, so you'll be able to join the second stream if you so choose. So you have a choice between Booster 1 and Booster 2, and that link will come out probably in the next 20 minutes or so. All right. So with that, I guess I'll hand things over to Mike. Thank you very much.
So this morning we're going to talk about persistent identifiers, a thing that is ubiquitous, but a lot of people don't know about. This is originally a 1-hour workshop, and I'm going to try to shoehorn this into about 18 minutes, and I ask you to buckle up. We're going to move briskly, but hopefully this is coherent. We'll see how it goes, I guess. I'm as excited to find out how this works as you are. So I'd like for you to keep the thought on the back burner while I'm talking about this a little bit. If you're not familiar, this is a screenshot from SimCity 2000, incredibly released in 1993, big swing. And what you're looking at is the pipes, the sort of water infrastructure of a city in SimCity. So I'm asking you to think a little bit about sort of infrastructure and water lines and stuff. And that sounds kind of funny. We're talking about scholarly publishing, and I'm asking you to think about this. But PIDs are in the drinking water of scholarly publishing. They're really everywhere. So I'm going to ask you to think about this and kind of keep that in mind while we're moving. So I'll come back to this in a bit, and we'll review what this all means. So let's start small. How about the DOI? DOIs are pretty common. We all know these quite well. They're ubiquitous. You see them everywhere, right? They're in references. They're in bibliographies. They're on journal article websites. They're in repos. They're in published data sets. They're in links in Twitter and ResearchGate and academia. A very common way to share content out. We know one handy thing about them. Usually, if you click on them, it takes you to where the content is. That's sort of the standard thing that we know about them. DOIs are the most prominent persistent identifier. We see them basically everywhere in scholarly publishing, and they're also arguably the most important persistent identifier in scholarly publishing. So DOIs are made up of two chunks, a prefix and a suffix. The first chunk you'll almost always see is a 10 dot and then like a 4 to 6 digit string of numbers. And then the suffix, which will be like a long string of crazy things, or maybe it'll be readable, kind of depends on the people who are creating them. Together, those make a DOI. So 10 dot whatever, slash, and then the back chunk, prefix and suffix. Prefixes and suffixes mean different things. So the prefix, the 10.4324 in this case, usually associated with a publisher or an organization. So you'll see a bunch of DOIs and they all have the same prefix. It's a good indication that they all came from the same publisher. And then the back part, the suffix, those are meant to be machine readable only, not human readable. They're opaque, they're unique, and it's a string that is specific to the singular word. That's kind of the unique identifier. That's the unique part. So a bunch of things can share the same prefix. That's not unique, but the suffix is unique. If I prepend a DOI with https:/doi.org, it turns into a URL. And if I click that URL, it'll redirect me to where the publication is. So if I click on a DOI written out as a URL, it'll take me to the content, and that's referred to as resolution. When you go to where a DOI is, that's referred to as a DOI resolution. So we'll talk a little bit about what resolutions are. So DOIs aren't like a bit.ly link or a tiny URL. Like a lot of people think of them as just like a shortcut to where the content is. If you're not familiar with those services, they'll swap out like a really big URL, and you can replace it with this tiny little thing you can fit on a business card or whatever. So for example, there's a bit.ly link there, a short version, and then below is the actual link to the talk, which is enormous. So if I want to give somebody a link to something that has a big URL, I can get a bit.ly link and it's much shorter. So those are just basic redirects. They just say like, when you access this bit.ly, redirect it to this URL in another place. DOIs are a little bit different though. They're a lot more than a redirect. DOI is a reference to an entire metadata record related to a publication. Every publication record has metadata, right? Like titles and authors, publishers, dates, all these kinds of things. And the DOI is related to all of the publication metadata related to that thing. And one of those metadata elements is the publication's URL, where it is, where you can find the content. When you resolve a DOI by clicking on it, the record's accessed, that big metadata record, the stored URL is retrieved, and then you're sent to where the stored URL is. Your browser takes that link and goes to where it comes. The URL can be updated by the publisher, but the DOI stays the same. They can always update where that DOI resolves to. This is a metadata record, and obviously you can't see this fully, but what's important to know is that there's a ton of information in a metadata record. So I can get the publisher, I can get the deposit and update timestamps, book types, contributors, and then the role in which those contributors were in, first author, those kinds of things. Title and subtitle, publication date, DOI for the book, link for the book, chapter title, DOI for the chapter, and link for the chapter. So this is just a single monograph, a little bit different for journal articles and different for other kinds of publications. But there's a huge amount of metadata that lives in these DOI records. So this is just a quick zoom in of this record, and you'll see at the top we've got the DOI, and then the timestamp for when it was created, and then the resource, the link to that thing, and then below we have the same for the chapter. The DOI for the chapter, the timestamp, and then the resource for the chapter. So obviously the DOI is going to be shorter than that enormous link below. So URLs are part of that metadata of the DOI. When you change the location of the content, you update the DOI record, but the DOI gets to stay the same, which is why when you click on a DOI, you always go to where that content is. Neat. Surely there's more to it. So again, I'm going to ask you to think about this sort of infrastructure question. And consider what else more there might be to it. But I'll tell you this, now that we've talked about this one piece, you already know more about DOIs than a frankly surprising amount of people. Most people just think you click on the thing and it takes you to the thing and that's it, that it's this kind of magical thing. And by extension, you also know more about persistent identifiers than a surprising amount of people. And I really mean a surprising amount of people. Like you would think that there are, every librarian, for example, knows about, but it's not the case. So, you're ahead of the game. So let's step back a bit. We're going to talk about what PIDs are. So PIDs, basic persistent identifiers. So it's an identifier, a label which gives a unique name or label to an entity, person, place, or thing. And it's persistent, which means long-lasting. DOIs are identifiers. DOI is an acronym for Digital Object Identifier. DOIs are used for articles, data sets, issues, journals, galleys, preprints, theses, proceedings, monographs, reports, standards, basically anything that's a publication. But it could be anything. You could use a DOI for a website. You could have a DOI for a PDF. DOIs can be kind of assigned to a million different things. An identifier, obviously, is a unique string of characters assigned to something, someplace, or someone that can be used to identify it. So we're familiar with identifiers in our regular life all the time. You have a social insurance number, a driver's license number, Medicare numbers, license plate numbers, student numbers. We're assigned identifiers constantly. And so we know what identifiers are, and they typically refer to physical objects, created and managed locally. So for example, UNB student ID is the only useful label for UNB students. can't go use my UNB student ID, for a government document or whatever. And same for social insurance numbers. They're provided federally. I can't use those in every situation. There's more than one Nason in Canada, but only one of them has my social insurance number, which is how you know it's an identifier for me. It's a unique identifier for this person. So identifiers are handy in this way. So persistent identifiers share the same benefits, right? A DOI is good for disambiguation. If I have a DOI for an article, I know it's going to take me an article. I can retrieve data that way. I can search for content the same way that a social insurance number would be used for. Like if every article published had its own little tiny registration with the government. Kind of how to think of it. I'm going to scratch the surface a bit on what a DOI does, but URL storage and redirection is just like one small benefit, actually. It seems like I just showed you about how there's so much more behind a DOI, but it's actually really just one small piece. So let's talk about persistence for a second. Persistent identifiers most frequently refer to digital things. So, we share or locate digital things most of the time using a URL. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. And we know the URLs break all the time for lots of different reasons. So somebody gives you a link to something and you click on it and you get a big 404. You go, the link didn't work, it was broken, there's nothing here. Because content moves or content becomes outdated, web services collapse, these kinds of things. So we don't have access to the content. Persistent identifiers, though, the URL can tell you where something was when you read it. So if I give a URL to somebody, I know, let's say I'm looking through a citation list for somebody's paper, and I know they put a URL in there. That's where it was when they read the thing. So if I get a book and I've got a bunch of references in the book and there's URLs in their citation section, I go like, well, there's like a 50-50 chance if I go to open this URL, it's still going to be in this spot. You're assuming the work will still be there, but obviously that's not guaranteed. So as you discussed earlier, using a DOI, I can update the location of the content. I can provide a persistent link to a record that contains URLs. So the ID is persistent, where it directs me may change. The DOI is persistent, where the DOI resolves may change. So I'm going to want to use a DOI instead of a URL most of the time. So imagine, again, we're finding a citation for this work in a bibliography. Which of these two will be more useful if the content moves from the website it's currently on? Up top, we have a great big link to Taylor and Francis, books, mono, and then actually they put the DOI in the URL, and then metadata dash author name. And then below, we just have the citation with just the DOI. The DOI is going to work more times than the URL. So what about pits for things that aren't publications? So ORCID is kind of the big one. ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor ID. It's also the name of the not-for-profit organization that provides ORCID IDs, maintains the service, develops the website and the API. ORCIDs are a kind of pit. First and foremost, ORCIDs help consistently and properly identify the author's works, no matter what their name is, was, or will be. So, people transition, they change their last name, they get married, they move to a country and change the way they pronounce their name or write their name. There are lots of ways in which names are not consistent. Even through publishing disciplines, some people always write their name as like an R. last name, or they write Richard last name. It can change the way that stuff goes. So if you use ORCID, you sort of consistently display your name or represent your work with an ID, so you're identified by an ID instead of by the name value. Nearly every publisher can take an ORCID ID as metadata associated with a publication, and ORCIDs are included as metadata in DOIs, which means your identity is always consistently portrayed across all of the places in which. So for example, I might write my own name as Nason, Michael Thomas William Nason, M. Nason, M. Nason, Hem Nason, and there may be more than any one of these. There could be more than one Mike Nason, there could be more than one Michael Nason, and I know this because I get their emails all the time at my Gmail account. And then Michael Thomas William Nason is an interesting example because I have two middle names, but most places I fill out a name form, there's only space for one middle name, which for Western white people is common and not an issue, but for people from other cultures who have to figure out how to shoehorn specific meanings of multiple names can be really awful. So it's a better way to sort of consistently represent your name or your person that way. So my ORCID is just this. So if I publish and I have this ORCID, it doesn't really matter what my name is. Now I have the ORCID associated with my work, and I can be located. So it's a persistent identifier for me, for people. ORCID also provides users with what's known as an ORCID profile. So when you hear someone talk about a scholar profile or a researcher profile, they're probably talking about ORCID. Scopus ID, Research ID, Google Scholar isn't one. I've done a handful of talks on this, and links for them are on the next slide. And I'm sure the links for this will be talks on. So what a persistent identifier does is make things easier to find, track, share, and access. My articles have DOIs. I can provide persistent links to the most recent location, which will ensure ease of access and citation. If my ORCID ID is present as metadata in the DOIs of the work I publish, I can pull my publication record easily and add it to my record profile. And then say if a funding agency wants to pull metadata from my record profile, they can acquire all of my publication metadata without me having to fill out a pile of forms. So all of that open infrastructure kind of pushes content from place to place, pushes this metadata around more easily. So persistent identifiers, unique, unchanging identifier representing an object, digital or otherwise, that can direct a user unambiguously to that object's current location. A PID can't just do this inherently, though. So they're not magic. They don't just do this. PIDs require a third party. So often folks use the phrase minting a DOI. They talk about doing that to create DOIs for things. I see this a lot. An editor might say to me, well, I made all these DOIs, but they don't work. I just get an error. So the other part is you have to register DOIs with a PID registration agency. There's a place where you actually register all of these to, a place where they live. I'm going to ask you to think about infrastructure. There's a bunch of registration agencies. Persistent identifiers are managed by these registration agencies. They're typically international not-for-profits that store records and metadata, facilitate resolution requests, may or may not offer other services based on membership, and they do a lot of this through what's called an API, and we'll talk about APIs in a second. There are a lot of registration agencies. It's important to know that registration agencies differ in mandate and governance, scope, service, supported objects, membership terms. They're not all the same, basically, but they do all share information and content with each other consistently. So again, infrastructure. So we'll review some of these real quick. There's Crossref. Crossref handles articles, proceedings, monographs, data sets, funding agencies, grants, reports, standards, preprints. They are the predominant DOI provider for most of scholarly publishing. When I wrote this sentence on April 6th, they had 134 million DOIs registered with their service. Crossref are a big deal. That is where most DOIs are, and most of the time when you retrieve information about a DOI, it's with Crossref. DataSite is typically used for software, data sets, collections, audiovisual, event model, publications, and some scholarly publishers use DataSite. For most of the case, it's data or institutional repositories and other places. But DataSite and Crossref work together. They work in concert. They share metadata with each other and they communicate regularly. Then there's researchers. There's ORCID, ISNI, Scopus ID, Web of Science Researcher ID. Those are PIDs for people. And they're the ORCIDs that go to here. Scopus and Web of Science, they're restricted to publications present on those platforms. But those services all share data as well. Then for organizations, there's ROR, GRID, and ISNI. So UNB has a ROR ID, a persistent identifier for this institution. There's good odds no one will ever really need to know what that is. It should just kind of happen to people without people knowing. But the beauty of it is you can add that identifier to any work that came out of our institution, and then you can hit, varying metadata fields and get a sense as to whether or not, or what research is coming out of an institution, because they all have this ID attached. Quick example of ROR, why this is necessary is like we write UNB as UNB, University of New Brunswick, UNB FSJ. We write what UNB is in a million different ways. So trying to find all the research that came from UNB can be a huge pain, but if you have a ROR value, it actually becomes super easy. Registration agencies provide metadata schemas through which users can describe the objects they're registering PIDs for. As you can imagine, you might describe these things a little bit more differently than you describe a data set or a journal article, an organization. These things are all a little bit different for people. So again, the metadata. It's different for every place you get metadata from. And this metadata is hugely useful. These are all the different things that Crossref would store. So title, subtitle, authors, ORCIDs, affiliation, copyright license, funder and grant IDs, languages, ROR references, research locations, all of this stuff. And they provide all of it through a public API. You can get any of this at any point. This is an enormous amount of metadata. And I'll go real quick through what an API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface. So an API is basically a set of rules for interacting with software. A little like a translator working as an intermediary between two people who don't speak the same language. APIs are everywhere. So if I look at my calendar app for today, I get a weather forecast. That comes from the AccuWeather API. If I get a notification on my watch from my phone, that's because the Garmin API is speaking to the Apple API. Those two APIs are communicating and sending the content together. So APIs are how all of these organizations share metadata and content back and forth with one another. So again, the water supply, I'm asking you to think about. So this is open scholarly infrastructure. If you ever hear this phrase, and I say it all the time, this network of APIs is like a municipal water system. It is increasingly infrastructure relied upon by researchers and institutions, whether or not they are really aware of it. Almost all open scholarly infrastructure is based around these APIs that communicate with one another. So ROR, DataSite, Crossref, ORCID. And then these places are the places that put DOIs into those places. So GitHub, Identifers, Noto into DataSite, and publishers put stuff into Crossref. And then Zotero and Mendeley both leverage Crossref's API to pull metadata into those services. So if you give them a DOI, you can just pull that metadata into your records. And then OpenAir and Google Scholar index content based on DOIs, so they can, you put in content and then you can make your metadata more rich by hitting whatever metadata is pulled from those places. And then there's university research management systems, and funders are able to pull that information. And then you get services like Unpaywall or Share Your Paper, places that can tell you if work is open access or not. And that all happens based on the Crossref API, sort of hitting that metadata to see where. So in concert with Open Scholarly Infrastructure, PIDs allow us to see the big picture of these connections and interactions, and it can expose these relationships between data and research and institutions, outcomes, and it can make outcomes more discoverable. When we talk about PIDs, we're talking about supporting open infrastructure and the free exchange of metadata. Metadata is often free. Like, we run into a lot of stuff that we can't get to because there's a paywall. The metadata is almost always free to access, and we can learn a lot from the metadata. So PIDs aren't just links to things, academic bit.ly, status symbols, permanent, they're not magic, but they are potentially huge time savers, useful for finding research, interconnected between services, and the backbone of open scholarly infrastructure. That was me. I gave a longer version of this talk here. There's a video that Marc uploaded. I hope this was clear.
Basically, I'm in the Harriet Irving Library Research Commons. We all are on the 3rd floor of the library here in Fredericton, and we opened in September. It's a space with a lot of different technologies as well as configurable meeting spaces. If you're in Fredericton in the summer, it's also one of the best ventilated, most modern ventilated spaces on campus, as well as having air conditioning. So if you're kicking around in the summer, it's not a bad place to come up, have a meeting, or just escape for a little bit, do some research, whatever else you want to do. I think the coffee shop here is open in the summer as well. So Mike is a scholarly communications librarian, and part of what I do is act as the knowledge mobilization and digital pedagogy librarian. And so what that involves is helping faculty and students, particularly graduate students, with innovative ideas for projects and assignments, or just ones that are aligned with the times that we're in. And so what that involves in part is offering different technologies, such as the Lightboard Studio for knowledge mobilization. And by that, what I mean is scholarly communication, you kind of think of it as communicating amongst researchers who have a basic common understanding of a discipline, working kind of at the same level and being able to share research. Knowledge mobilization overlaps with that, but it can also be thought of as a way of moving your research out into the public sphere or beyond your disciplinary confines. And so making it a little bit more understandable or relatable to people outside your discipline, be they other researchers that you might be interested in partnering with in some sort of interdisciplinary initiative, or just making your ideas known to the public or to funders. And so that's the sort of thing that I help with, and we have technologies to aid with it. Even if you're not going to be in Fredericton this summer or the foreseeable future, myself and other librarians and staff here are available to discuss the sorts of projects that you might be interested in and advise regardless of what your particular material circumstances might be. So basically where I am right now is in a black box room, and in front of me there is a transparent, translucent piece of glass. And if you can see, as I get my hands closer to the side, there's some light in my fingertips, and so you can see I'm lit up too. So basically the board itself is lit. There's a decent microphone above me, studio quality, and a 4K camera in front. And so basically somebody can come in here and do all sorts of things that I'm going to show you a little bit about. And so some of the things you can do might involve knowledge mobilization, getting in the thick of things. As we know nowadays, video is for now, in the foreseeable future, the preeminent means of conveying your research beyond your own particular disciplinary confines. More teaching is happening online or through video than ever, and it's just a way that communication is happening to an extent that it hadn't not very long ago, and it certainly is ramped up. So you can be in the thick of things when you're actually doing video rather than just being a disembodied voice with screens being shared and that sort of thing. It also prompts you to think visually a little bit so that you can be competitive in your particular discipline and working with funders or getting your ideas out there. Haven't shown you this yet, but it's an actual board that you can write on. So do things like, well, maybe I wanted to measure up to my competitor here. So you can do all sorts of fun things like this, but it allows you basically to present, annotate, and comment on your ideas and the ideas of others, which demonstrates the dynamism inherent in scholarly discourse. So what's not to love about that? You can also run meetings or teach in a space such as this. So whether you're a whiteboard user or not, and I can tell you that given the proliferation of whiteboards on this particular floor, there's more and more of them for sure. Space like this would allow you to do some brainstorming or whatever kind of visual representation was germane to your purpose, which can be useful. So something to keep in mind. The nice thing is that you're actually part of the action, as mentioned. So just to talk a little bit about my own research and give you a demonstration, one area that I work in has to do with intercultural communication as it pertains to online learning and as a librarian to supporting students who are offsite. So this is basically riffing off of the work of Edward Hall, a pioneer in the area of intercultural communication. And this has to do with modeling the dynamic between instructors and students. And basically the gist of what I look at and have been working on theoretically, or working from theoretically, has to do with the fact that each of us contain multiple cultures. We contain multitudes if we understand culture as a set of shared values and behaviors shared to a group. And so that might have to do with your education, your family background, your nationality, your ethnicity, your multiple ethnicities, your religion, even the activities that you're involved with. Maybe you're a chess player, maybe you're a hockey player, maybe you're both. And so we take all of our identities that are all mixed up inside of us, and we bring them to particular interactions between individuals in this culture of dealing. And that will look differently depending on the individuals and the medium in which it takes place. And so what happens when that medium, for example, is good old Teams? Well, as we've experienced, mute or no, it can be a bit of a disengaging experience. You can feel disembodied, like you're floating in space and your mind is anywhere else than where you're at the moment. Very much two-dimensional, maybe we'd even call it dim. Now, what happens, however, when you port this sort of thing into an environment, get an embarrassment of markers here. Let's say, that's not a nice one. If you port this sort of discussion into the Lightboard studio, well, then suddenly it's much more of an embodied experience, because I always have a problem writing embodied, because the instructor is embodied and in front of you. It's more engaging experience. And basically what it amounts to for me is a better marriage of content and the person delivering, which is very much what the booster series that we've been running since September is meant to do. So I'm just doing this so you have kind of an idea of what this sort of space enables. And I know anecdotally that there have been instructors on campus before we opened that had actually built their own Lightboard studios and were under their desk running them and then having to flip the image so that the text is going the right way and that sort of thing. And spaces like this handle all that for you. So there's other spaces like that. And at the end of today, we'll be going through a hybrid tour of the spaces. And you'll see, basically, we started out here in the data visualization lab. I ran over here to the Lightboard studio. We've got an audio studio here, the fabrication lab. Some of you who are on site or tuning into the more STEM-like sessions will be in the Innovation Hub. So we'll go around and have a look at things. But basically, for me, a big part of what today is about is to give people a chance to associate expertise and capacity with folks here at the UNB libraries, wherever they may reside. So I believe we have a bit of a break now, and as Jamie mentioned at the beginning, you will have received a couple of links to the concurrent sessions to choose from, and we'll see you there.
Hey, my name's Leah Grandy, and I'm a special collections assistant in Archives and Special Collections. And today I've been brought in to talk to you about a technology you can use to present your research that's actually freely available here at UNB, and it's called Storymaps. Now, Storymaps use geomatics technology. So engineering students probably have used this type of program before. The software comes from a company called Esri, which is kind of the Microsoft of geographic software, and so used around the world. And it uses the software is called ArcGIS. Now, the type of software I use, I'm not a technical person, and it was something I was able to learn to use, is story mapping. Now, your research would have to have some sort of geographic content component to it, which most research does have some sort of geographic content to it. Now, I'm a historian, so I've used it to present historical biographies, and I'm also going to show you some examples that come from the humanities as well, but definitely this could be used by the social sciences for to present any type of data you collect. I could see it very easily and have seen it used for like paleontology, biology, to show visually geographic data that you've collected. And I'm not the expert on this technology here. The expert is Siobhan Hanratty. She's our GIS librarian, and I'll tell you how to get in contact with her at the end if you're interested in learning more. And she's very happy to help. And I can say, as somebody that knew nothing about GIS technology before I started this, that she is very good at explaining it and helping you come up with a good product in the end. So when we did and the project I'm going to be showing you today was out of the microforms collection. Some of you might not even know what microforms are. It's a type of format we use to have historical documents. And we have a collection here at UNB called the Loyalist Collection that's centered around the experiences of refugees of the American Revolution. So those were people that were on the side of the British Crown, which was the losing side, and a lot of them came to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So we have a collection of their documents. So this was envisioned as a way to promote that collection. But in that way, this type of interface could be great to promote your research as well to a broader audience, to an academic audience, and beyond an academic audience. And that was kind of the way we used it. Now, this project, we did the research in tangent with this being the idea of the end product, but you may already have data you can envision using for this. And I would say the technical component of it is very user-friendly, but what limits is your own creativity and vision for how you can use this to display your research. All right, so this project, New Brunswick Loyalist Journeys, we used traditional historical research, then along with this geographic technology. And this was a project we started in 2017. It was a very collaborative project. Many different students were involved with this, along with staff as well. So it was very much a group effort. And ours is a layered approach. We have 30 biographies of individuals, and there's 10 in each of these county tabs here. And then we also have an overview of the project that tells you a bit about it. Now, there are many different formats that you can use for the story maps, and I'm going to show you a couple more from other institutions before we're finished. So the counties here, I'm actually going to go through one specific loyalist to give you an idea here. One of my favorites that I researched myself. So, okay. This the loyalist I'm going to show you today is Christopher Sauer III, and he was one of New Brunswick's earliest printers. He printed one of the first newspapers in New Brunswick, and also other publications like the Journals of the House of the Legislative Assembly. And for every loyalist, we were able to get their signature, which was very interesting. And this was a way we also wanted to present what our basic data is when we're doing history is a primary document. So documents created at the time. And so we've integrated these into the story maps. Now, what you're looking at here is a historic map, but it's actually overlaying a modern map, like it uses Google Earth underneath it. And we have this because it shows the way people saw the world at the time that he lived, which we're talking about around 1783. But not the most accurate when you zoom in, like Philadelphia's right here, and it would be out in the ocean if you zoomed in. And all these points you see here are life events. Let me see if I can get it to come up. I was earlier, yeah. So they all show different points of his life. And behind this, it's pulling on Google Maps. It's also pulling on a spreadsheet. So that's how you have to format your data to put it into the story map. And that's the part that Siobhan can often help you with, cleaning your data and getting it to present. And that's what's mapping these points here is a spreadsheet. It's not that hard. You just have to have consistency and accuracy. So we've arranged, because of the type of our research, into chapters of his life. So this is his background here. Now, the story maps are a very visual format. So for some topics, it might be harder or easier to find images. When we're talking about the late 18th century, it can be quite hard to find images from the time, right, before camera. So sometimes we do use pictures from modern times, but sometimes we're able to find contemporary images. Now, a word of caution about this, especially you guys coming from an academic perspective as we were, you want to have copyright permissions and good citations for all your images, right? You can't just grab anything from Google and put it up. So that sometimes is a process, asking for those permissions. Also, these story maps won an award in 2018, an international award for one of the best story maps of the year. And this was because it hadn't been used in an academic fashion for humanities, this kind of interface. And one of the things we did to make sure that it was academic is we created this whole other component that has all our citations in it. When you're doing history, your footnotes, endnotes, bibliography, really important. So we created a whole other component to make sure that if interest was piqued by this, then they could go and find more information or where we got our information from. Okay, and let me show you some of this. So some of the other features you can do with using the GIS technology is draw these direction lines. And one of the reasons that the loyalists fit really well for this was because especially Christopher Sower was really well traveled. He traveled all over the world. He went to London a few times and was all in the Philadelphia area. He may have even gone to Virginia and then to New Brunswick. So it's really good to show. I think this was working. Yes. There we go. Showing some of his path lines. And I think I didn't practice that before, but that's pretty cool. Showing some of the path lines that he took during his life. Now, when you're using any type of format like this, you have to think about how it might affect the data you're presenting. And one thing we looked at is we make sure we call those dots representative points, because obviously these people did not have GPS trackers in them in the 1870s, so we don't know that for sure they were right there. So, but we know about they were there. Sometimes we know for sure they were born in this house and we can figure out where that house was, but sometimes that takes a lot of work. And so you're able to integrate a lot of great images into this. And he was friends with this quite famous gentleman from the American Revolution, John Andre. I think we actually have a letter written to him. Yes, so this is an example of how we can showcase some of the documents from our collection. This was a letter from John Andre, it's signed right there. All right, and then there's an example of one of the neat things with this research is that I was able to visit a lot of places that these loyalists live. So this was a picture I took myself, which is a great option for copyright because there's no copyright restriction on it if you take it yourself. All right, so I want to show you just quickly some other examples. And if you go on if you type in Esri Storymap Gallery, it'll give you more examples of how people put things together. And it just depends on how much time and resources you have and your imagination as well. So a lot of them you'll see use a lot are kind of set in modern times, so they can use some really stunning images. So this one is about Indigenous knowledge, and you see there is a mapping component, but it actually incorporates audio files as well, and you can have videos as well. And usually there's a feature you can either scroll through, like that's a way a lot of websites are done now, or you can skip to chapters as well. If you're in humanities and to show a lot of innovative ways story maps can be used, the Smithsonian from the United States, they have a great series of story maps. This one is a slaving ship, the Say Jose, and it has vocal components. It has really cool maps, so they always spend a lot of time on. But you can see it, so as much time as you have, but it might, I've seen people actually use these as kind of portfolios as well. They're getting really popular as presentation tools instead of using PowerPoint. I'm actually using these story maps to present at a conference I'm presenting at in a couple weeks. So they're a great presentation tool as well. Let's see. Oh, and also, if any of you are teaching or going to teach, it's a very good teaching tool as well. Our Loyalist story maps have been used in a number of undergrad and graduate courses. And some of the feedback we've got from students is that some people that have different approaches to learning, it's an easier way for them to wrap their mind around the topic than just reading a text. And also for us, it's a great way to introduce them to using primary documents because they're all there available right on the story map for them to use. And so I guess what I would say my lesson from this is story maps and other digital platforms are a great way to get your research out and to make connections. We've actually, since we launched these story maps, we've had way more traffic to our collection website. I've been asked to do way more presentations and outreach, so I think that can work just as well for students too. And I'll just finish off by saying, if I've piqued your interest, you can contact Siobhan Hanratty. Her email is hanratty@unb.ca, or you can find her through Get Specialized Help on the website.
So usually when I talk about archives and how they work, I do need a full hour because, you know, I'm trying to cram in a lot of information. And so in this 14 minutes, I don't know if I'm going to tell anyone anything of use, but how many here are in history? What? How many have used archives before? No, okay. Yeah, is anyone online there yet listening? So has anyone online ever used archives or? No response.
I have before, yes.
I love
for,
doing stuff
coursework.
online. I love the whole Teams thing. I'm someone who just wants to sit on my butt at my desk and not have to go anywhere, you know, but there is that thing about presenting to an online audience, you know, there's just no response, no reaction. So I'm sure it was very hard for the professors and the students the last couple of years. Is there something? Oh, cool. Well, you know, a lot of people think archives are mostly about history, but for instance, we have a whole bunch of engineering drawings in the collection, which might be of interest to engineers. Around the Isthmus of Chignecto, they were going to build a train that was going to cut across between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So we have all the engineering drawings and photos of that engineering works. that never really came to fruition. I think there are some actual ruins of that work somewhere on the isthmus. Am I pronouncing that right? Isthmus. Anyway, so there, you never know what you'll find in archives. We collect so many things from so many different departments of the university, that kind of thing. There might be something there if someone wanted to do the history of engineering or the history of psychology or something. Okay, so now I get started. All right, so thank you very much for having me. My name's Christine Lovelace. I'm head of UNB's Archives and Special Collections. And I want to talk to you first. I just mentioned what archives are for those who aren't, who haven't used archives. It is a collection of primary documents that document the functions and activities of a person or an organization. Usually they are unpublished, and they are the rich place where historians might go to write their histories that then get published. So these are these primary documents that you would read and analyze to get a sense of what was going on at a certain time in a certain place. Now, archives usually work by mandates, and it's good to know an archives mandate when you're trying to find what you're looking for. And in our specific case, we are on the same campus location as the Provincial Archives in New Brunswick. So a lot of people get us mixed up. We often get calls for provincial records. So we are the university archives. The university's been around since about 1785, 1800. And so we've been collecting the records of the university in our archives. And we are located on the 5th floor of the Harriet Irving Library. In 1967, 68, we sold our first library, well, second library, the Bonar Bennett Library, to the government, and that became the Provincial Archives in New Brunswick. So it's just down the street here. So their mandate is to collect the records of the province. Our mandate is to collect the records of UNB. Now, the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick didn't come into existence till 1968. So we collected a lot of stuff in the absence of a provincial archives that actually is provincial in nature. So we also have a historical collection, and we've also dedicated ourselves to collecting the books of New Brunswickers and New Brunswick publishers. We call it NBANA, and we have a lot of those in our special book collections. And we also have collected the literary papers of New Brunswick authors and New Brunswick publishers. So our mandate is focused on UNB, New Brunswick authors and publishers, and some New Brunswick history that we collected. So we've got 3 numbering systems. We've got something MGH for the history collections, MGL for the literary collections, and UARG for the university archives. And I'll show you this in the catalog. Okay, but one of the things I wanted to show you first was the research guides, because under these research guides, and there's my big ugly mug there in the corner, you can find information about what UNB's archives has to offer you. And it talks about what archival materials we have in our collections, and there's that information about the university archives and the literary fond. Fond is a funny word. Fond means the collection of one creator, and it's from the French term respect des fonds. So respect what the creator has created and don't break it apart, keep it together. If you see in Canada something called fond, that means it is the creation of one creator. If you see elsewhere a title that says collection, it means it's probably been brought together artificially. So if you have shipping ledgers from one shipping company, the APC shipping company, that is their fond. They created it in their day-to-day business. If you have someone who just loved collecting ledgers from antique places and auctions, and they bring it together as a shipping ledger collection, then that is a collection. So that's kind of the difference. They're not as, they don't use the term fond in the States. They might say papers or collection, but fond is used in kind of Europe and Canada. So that's why what that word means. So when you say literary fond, it means the papers of literary New Brunswickers. So you can get some information there. You can also get some contact information here if you need to get in touch with us. If you ever have any questions about any of this, please feel free to send an email to archives@unb.ca. And we're happy to answer any questions or talk to you about your research and tell you what's available. We also set this tab up here, digital resources for teaching and research. So we have a whole bunch of different databases that might be of use that if I have time at the end, I will show to you. But know that they are here to look through if you're interested. Like I'll just quickly show you the UNB class composite and group photos. We've taken all those giant composite photos and put them into a database so you can search people who used to go to UNB. I think we've got them in there up to about 1970. special collections. We've got special book collections, and you can see there's just a few listed here. We have over 25. We've got something called HIL Spec AR. So if you're ever looking up a special collections book you want to get from the 5th floor, you have to make sure you add the HIL Spec AR or HIL Spec RB number to that call number so that we know which collection it's from. We have all the UNB theses. We have some rare books. We have the Beaverbrook Rare Book Collection. We've tried to recreate the King's College Library. So when we were King's College from 1839 to 1859, we've tried to recreate what books would have been in that library, what the students would have studied during that time. That might be a really interesting project for someone in the Department of Education to take on. What were they studying? So more information there. And there's also, what's really useful here is you can limit your searches on special collections books by using something called B8. It's kind of like a Boolean searching term. And so that's all explained in our subject guide here, which can be very useful. We've also got some information about our photographs. We have lots and lots of photographs of UNB activities. So how you would find that. People are often confused as how to cite archival collections. It's not as easy as citing a published book, for instance. So we have information here about how you can do that for your footnotes and bibliography. And then we just got some other archives related resources here. Now, we also have a subject guide on the First Nations material that's available in archives and special collections. We're very lucky that people have donated to us in the past or have been connected to UNB in some way who have done research on Indigenous peoples. And so this will also talk to you, about what we actually have in the archives. And for instance, we have the Indian Affairs collection, and it's all been digitized. We have the Winslow Papers, which is an incredible resource for both Loyalist history and New Brunswick, early New Brunswick history. And there is mention of Indigenous people in there if you search through it. We also have these other phone, especially the Peter Paul phone, which is, he was a researcher that donated all his work to us. And it's a very rich collection. So if you're interested in First Nations, like if you're in anthropology or something, you might be interested in some of these collections. So the research guides are useful. How am I doing for time? So this is our main website, and this is where you can get some of those databases I mentioned. So you can either get them from the special guides, or you can get them from our website here under Research Tools. I'm going to show you these two buttons. This is our archives catalog. Now, sometimes people think you can just Google stuff and find it, or you can go into the UNB Libraries catalog. But unfortunately, if you want to look for the archival collections in our collections, you have to go through our own catalog. It's called the Gateway. Awesome. Okay, that's all right. I've got other things to show you. We've just switched over to a new catalog, and it's being hosted by someone in Vancouver or something. That happens a lot, so we don't have control over that. If you're interested in UNB's history, we have developed a wiki. We had a bunch of wikithons where students would take information from our reference files and put them in here. So we have everything about, I don't know if you can see that because this thing's in the way, but we have UNB anniversaries, a brief history. We have history about all the buildings on campus. The different faculties and departments. We have stuff about the people of UNB, like artists in residence, chancellors, presidents, professors, women, a whole thing on the women at UNB first. So this is a very useful resource. Let's see. I wonder if this will bring me to, let's go back. Let's go back here. So I will show you, well, now, okay, if you want to see something in the archives, here's the issue. The books you can usually come up, and if you find someone, we can pull the book for you. You have to look at it in the Winslow Research Room because it doesn't circulate, because we have a lot of rare books. 5 minutes? Okay. But if you want to see anything from the archives, you have to let us know 24 to 48 hours in advance because it's stored off-site, so we have to retrieve it. So you can just email us at archives@unb.ca and make an appointment with us to come in and look. We're generally open Monday to Friday, 10 to 4, but we can, we're flexible and we can work with you to find a better time for you to come in. So you can find all our hours and our contact information on this website. And I'm going to show you some of the online databases. So we've got, here's the engineering stuff I was talking about. And you can see there's some graphic material. So you can see these pictures of them working with the steam engines and stuff to cut this railway through and make the passage for the rail. I don't know why it all didn't happen. I don't know if that might be something interesting for someone to research, is why didn't the railway go through? We've also got these Indian Affairs documents. A lot of dumpster diving was done at the time because no one was saving New Brunswick records. Not really dumpster diving back in the 1930s, but anyway. And so we have, you never know what we've got, even though our mandate is UNB and everything. It's really good to kind of dig around here and see what we have. So we have these Indian Affairs document. You can see here we've got actually a treaty, one of the treaties, and those are very important documents. Let's see if that's going to work again. I've only got a couple of minutes. Yep, I'm going to have to complain to someone about that, and this is why preparation is very important when you do speaking. Let me tell you about archival descriptions very quickly. You're going to find a title, so we try to put a title of what you're going to find in there. There's going to be a date range, so you know if what you're looking at is worth looking at it. If it's 1867 to 1870 and you're interested in 1900s, then that's no good to you. We have an extent that tells you there's 5 meters of records. So you say, I'm going to come in for the day, but 5 meters is this much. So that's how much you have to go through. If you know it's only a box of 2 centimeters, then you know you probably could look at your stuff within a day. Then it has a description of the person who created it. So it puts everything in context, when they were born, what they did for a living, when they died, and that tells you what kind of records you're going to find in this collection. And then there's a scope and content note, which tells you, okay, in this collection, you're going to find minutes, correspondence, or whatever kind of photographs. So it tells you the kind of material. And then there's any notes, if there's any restrictions, or for instance, a lot of stuff gets divided up. So part of William Bragdon Jack's papers, he was a president of UNB, are here, and some of his papers are at the New Brunswick Museum. So there'll always be a note telling you where the other stuff is. So I'm going to end that there because I'm really disappointed that I can't show you the catalog. Just know that it's a finicky thing. You search it by keyword, it'll give you a result. And then if you want to see the whole result, because we do everything hierarchically, we put the phone at the top, then there's different series underneath, like correspondence, photos. Then you drill down to file level, and then you drill down to the item, the specific photo you want. But in order to see that, you have to click Finding Aid at the top of the catalog. Anyway, that was a really short, I'm done. If there's any questions, maybe if anyone's interested, you can get in touch with me at archives@unb.ca, and I can demonstrate the catalog for you one-on-one.
I'm the Collections Analysis and Bibliometrics librarian. So I basically do a lot of data management. So I help sort of with our electronic serials data, and on the bibliometric side, I do sort of working with faculty publication data, but I can also help with like student projects if you're looking at doing any sort of bibliometric assessments, or working with like researcher data. Yeah, so am I good to start? Okay. Sorry? Good to go? Oh.
That was draconian time.
Yeah, 2 more minutes. Yeah, we also help with like, or I can also help with like, if you're applying for grants. I've helped the Office of Research Services a little bit with introducing bibliometric data into grant applications. So if bibliometrics are important to your field, then that's something you can definitely introduce to your grant application. So that's something to think about as well. Yeah.
Now, imagine I didn't know what bibliometrics meant.
Okay.
What would be your elevator pitch for bibliometrics?
Bibliometrics is basically the study of bibliographies. It's incredibly useful, especially in sort of like a data-informed world. We'll see with text and data text data mining how important it really is for discovering new research trends. Especially if you're in a sort of up and coming field, and discovering new knowledge. I think it's really important. So yeah.
Let's
But
spend
we'll-
a minute there. Richelle's gone.
Okay, get started. My name's Julie. I'm talking today about text data mining. And just a brief agenda. I'm going to start with an introduction. I'll introduce what text data mining is. I'll present a couple of case studies from humanities and arts, as well as business. Then I'll introduce some TDM products that we actually have here at the Harriet Irving Library. If you want to like get your hands dirty and actually start doing it. Then I'll talk about copyright considerations and introduce our text data mining subject guide. So there are on average more than 1.5 million scholarly articles published every year. This is like an overwhelming amount of knowledge that's being published annually. So we can use text data mining to kind of understand the important research trends and help support innovation and explore this large corpus of texts. With the increase in digitized and digital materials that are becoming available, TDM is really going to become an up-and-coming research trend. It's sort of new in the arts and humanities, but has been longer established in the STEM fields. So what is text data mining is the question. So text data mining is interdisciplinary in nature. It combines techniques from linguistics, computer science, library science, and statistics. It uses tools that can retrieve and extract information and meaning from a corpus of text. Basically, what it does is it uses natural language processing to read text. TDM can be used to extract new knowledge and information from a corpus of text. It can be used to find thematic patterns and trends and enable the systematic review of literature. What it's really great for is identifying new trends in scholarships, for example. You can use coding languages, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the main coding languages are Julia, Python, and R. We have some products that you can use that rely on coding and some that don't. So I'll introduce those a bit later. So what is the TDM process? The first step is information retrieval and collation. So you want to do keyword searches to retrieve documents. This can include documents like journal articles, newspapers, and even Twitter feeds are really popular. The next step is pre-processing your data. That's when you're going to clean, organize, and structure your data. And depending on, or what you want to do is like remove the noise, deduplicate, and make sure your data is consistent. So depending on whether your data is structured or semi-structured is going to depend on how much cleanup is involved. And I'll present a data cleanup tool in a bit. So some of the steps that are involved in this process are tokenization, which is breaking your text into elements that can be read by the computer. So breaking it up into individual words, filtering, stop word removal, which is taking out like the ands, the ors, the is, all those little words, and just getting to like the meat of your text. And then removing punctuation and making sure your cases are consistent. And then the final step is analyzing your data. And that's when you're going to do like visualizations and look for trends and things like that. So some of the terms that you're going to see come up in text data mining, and these are some methodologies that you're probably going to want to use to do analysis, are first part of speech tagging, which assigns a tag to every token or every word in a document based on whether it's like a noun an adjective, etc. Next is text categorization or classification, which is basically putting the text, different elements of the text or different words into different topics or categories based on, you know, what the computer thinks is basically how they should be clustered. Next is sentiment analysis, which looks for positive or negative sentiments in the text to let you know whether, you know, maybe a newspaper article is speaks positively or negatively about a topic. Next is word frequencies, that counts the number of words that appear in a text, or we also call them n-grams. There's also bigrams and trigrams. And then lastly, there's topic modeling, which clusters word groups and similar expressions into topics. So now for some case studies. The first one I wanted to talk about, and this is really specific to arts and humanities, is there was a case where, you know, just to give you an idea of how you can use text data mining, the first case is where two researchers mined the New York Times and other US newspapers to really measure how economic uncertainty has consequences on productivity, investment, employment, economic output, as well as the stock market. Another case, there were two researchers who were looking at patent filings to see, to basically assign a measure of importance to those inventions over time. And then the final one actually comes out of UNB. From our French department, there was a researcher who was looking at using text data mining to look at French documents to understand Akkadian markers of identity. Sorry, my presentation's not advancing. Sorry for the technical challenges. There we go. Sorry about that. So in terms of if you're a business student, text data mining is really useful. You can do things like analyzing Twitter feeds, news releases, and company conference calls to understand the effect of the news on the markets. My background is actually coming from an investment firm, and what we were doing was using TDM to take news articles to understand a company's reputation in the media, to understand whether or not we wanted to partner with those companies. So now I'll talk about some TDM products that we have here on campus and that you can use. The first is Ithaca's Constellate, and Gale Digital Scholar is the next one. These are two out-of-the-box products that we subscribe to. And what they do is they pull, you can do keyword searching and it'll pull from content that we subscribe to here at the library. So Constellate pulls from over 12 million documents from JSTOR and Portico and is most effectively used with Python programming. So what's great about Constellate is that it actually gives you access to sample Jupyter notebooks, as well as tutorials and classes to learn how to do the Python programming. So if you're interested in TDM, I highly recommend learning that skill. GDSL, or Gale Digital Scholar, pulls from more than 80 million items from our Gale content, such as the British Library newspaper. So if you're in history, this could be great. But it also allows you to upload your own content. Voyant is a free product that allows you to upload your own text and do analysis, but you have to be careful of copyright considerations. And Google Ngram Viewer pulls trends from Google Books. And finally, OpenRefine is a data cleaning tool, which I'll show you in a moment. So this is Constellate, and what it does is you put in your keywords, you can limit it to what years you're interested in, and the dashboard will create these visualizations for you. So here we can see, you know, there's word bubbles with keywords. It'll plot the trend of research over time in that related to your keywords. So that's really interesting. It also does things like you can look for keywords in the corpus, and it'll plot them based on the percentage of documents that it appears in over time, and does the same thing with subjects. Now, if you want to do some Python programming, they have sample Jupyter notebooks you can use, but it also will do things. You can use Python programming to do things like counting the number of occurrences of words in the corpus and create like word clouds. This is Gale Digital Scholar. On the left, you can either do a keyword search for which will scan through the documents we have licensed at UNB, or on the right, you can upload your own text, but you have to be mindful of copyright considerations. So in this case, we did a search of women in suffrage, to get a sense of what's in the collection. So in this case, GDSL produced, and you don't have to know Python for GDSL, I will make that clear. In this case, we ran a sentiment analysis, and in this case, what we plotted was basically we were looking at newspaper sentiments over time. So you can see how people's perceptions of women's suffrage may have changed over time. If you're in history, this might be really interesting to look at. And again, this plots, each point is a newspaper article, and it'll plot where which article sits in terms of sentiment. This is Ngram Viewer. I haven't used it a lot, but you can look up keywords and it'll show you basically how many times they occur in the corpus of Google Books over time. Voyant, I also don't have a lot of experience with, but you can upload your own content and run analysis. OpenRefine is extremely powerful. It's a data cleaning tool. You can upload your text files to it, and you can manipulate and change data right in the platform. It's an open tool. One thing I really like is the clustering function, which allows you to basically, OpenRefine will pick out instances that should be clustered together, and then you can like bulk change titles or elements. So it's really powerful. It's like Excel, but extremely powerful. If you're in any of the medical science disciplines, there are also some TDM products that are open that you can use. So they're listed here. I won't go into them today though. Now, one thing to be mindful of is copyright. There is no clear legislation in Canada about TDM. So you should always make sure you have secured the permissions for the text you're using in a TDM project. If you're using one of our out-of-the-box products, then we've secured the license permissions for you. If you're using your own data, then I highly recommend asking for help. You can come to Josh Dickinson, who is our copyright officer, and he will help you with everything you need to know. And then finally, this is our LibGuide, or our text and data mining guide. And here you can find links to all of the items and products that I mentioned today, as well as additional information on copyright. And anyone who's involved in TDM is listed along the right-hand side. So there's Eric Moore, myself, and Marc Bragdon, and Josh Dickinson is a great contact for copyright. And that is all.
So why has research data management become such an important part of research? Well, it's always been an important part of research, of course, but it's only been since we've kind of made the full-on shift to digital data collection and digital data preservation that it's become a little bit more important, a little bit more clear as to how important it is to make sure the data are properly preserved, and that we're thinking about reuse and the long-term life of that data. It can certainly be used for purposes that were well beyond what we were originally thinking about it being used for. So for example, Reinhard Rogoff and Herndon, that article is about a young man who is a graduate student who had an assignment to take a look at a particular article, any article you choose, and try and replicate the results from that article. So this young man picked one that was kind of generating a lot of hype and was actually being actively used as a basis for decisions about austerity in the UK. But the article that he shows, he couldn't really find a good way to replicate the results, and it was kind of stumping him, and it stumped his professors as well. They encouraged him to reach out and get in touch with the original researchers. They were willing to share his data, since this was a little bit before the time when we were actively thinking about data repositories and so on. But they were happy to share their original data with him. And once he got a look at that original data, very quickly he was able to spot some fairly significant errors in that. Now, that wouldn't have happened without access to that data. In other cases, we can see how data has long-term utility, and it can evolve to form the foundation for further studies. Just the example here, as long as we're planning for it, the examples of the cases of the 3 nurses' health study, which took place over the course of 40 years, starting in the late 70s and working all the way up to 2018. 2018, sure, it might not be quite that late, but over a number of years. And it's simply because the researchers were thinking about the long-term utility of their data, being able to reuse it, being able to base future research on the results that were found. On a bad news note, if we're not thinking about these sort of things, it can result in useless data, a lot of work lost, and a lot of work wasted. And a lot of the work that I talked about in just a few minutes ago, rather, it's only possible if data is well preserved and it's accessible. So in this case, we see a very well-funded project from the UK to try and recreate the Doomsday Book, which was essentially an inventory of what was happening in the UK at around 1000 or 1100. If they essentially spent a huge amount of money, very well-funded project to try and recreate that in modern UK. So there were thousands and thousands of files, audio files, images, data sets that were created and were recorded on media. The unfortunate part of this, though, is that it's almost a textbook case of what not to do for data preservation. So it was recorded on a 12-inch video disc that was dedicated to a specifically developed computer. So within 15 years, that data became completely inaccessible, and all the work that had been done wasn't really accessible by anybody, or couldn't be reused by anybody who was outside of that project or without immediate access to some of the specifically developed computers, which were becoming obsolete. So this is some of the things, or these are some of the things that we need to think about when preparing for the long-term life of our data. So these are the kinds of things that were in mind with the Tri-Agency when they developed the research data management policy that was released early last year. So the 3 agencies, SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR, launched the RDM policy on March 15th of last year, and it identifies incoming obligations that institutions and researchers are expected to handle to ensure that research data are being handled responsibly. And it all kind of comes back to this sense, really, this idea that research data, the agency believes that research data collected through the use of public funds should be responsibly and securely managed and be, where ethical and legal and commercial obligations allow, available for reuse by other people. It also recognizes, just to be clear here too, that there are significant differences in the practices from discipline to discipline to discipline in different areas of research too. It's worth noting with this, because I don't want people to get freaked out about this, it's worth noting that the policy has been developed hand in hand with developing RDM practice community in Canada. So when the tri-agencies were developing the policy, they actually reached out to members of the community or reached out to the RDM community in particular and said, it's the work that you've been doing to develop data repositories, to develop data management planning, and all of these other things that we require for this. It's that work that's enabled us to put this policy into place. So I want you to take away, one thing you take away from this talk is just to know that you're well looked after here at UNB. All the resources that you need, from data management planning all the way up to data deposit, the expertise and the help and the support that you need and the resources are all available for you here. So the panel, the policy is actually divided into 3 pillars: institutional strategy, the data management plan, and data deposit. Those are being rolled out sequentially. So data management planning is actually, theoretically, it's in effect right now. Institutional strategies will need to be rolled out at the beginning of next year, and data deposit requirements will come sometime shortly after that. Institutional strategy, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about because it's not something that we as individual researchers need to worry about, but it is something that the institution needs to make sure that we've got covered. So it's going to be a public document that'll be released a little bit later on this year, and it talks about how the institution is going to make sure that they've got adequate support for researchers, that we're promoting RDM practices within the community, we're adopting those best practices, and we're providing or we're supporting access to all of the resources that are needed. Now, on the researcher side, there are a few requirements that each of us individually are going to need to start thinking about. The first is the data management plan. Now, I mentioned that that was actually put into effect earlier this year. The tri-agencies were supposed to identify an initial set of funding opportunities that were going to start to require data management plans. Now, from the network that I'm a part of, we haven't yet actually seen any of those requirements start to roll out, at least within the tri-agencies, but you should know that they are coming, and they will be here at some point down the road. And as I mentioned earlier on, effective data management starts at the planning stage. So even when it's not a requirement, this is just a very, very good thing to do. There's some of the things that DMP will cover: data collection, documentation and metadata, storage and backup, preservation, whether or not you're going to be able to share it with the community, who's responsible for the data, and how you're complying with any ethical requirements or legal requirements. We strongly recommend the use of the DMP Assistant, which is an online tool. It's essentially just a template that kind of checks off all of the boxes that are required for an effective data management plan. It's freely accessible. All you need to do is create an account. I'm going to show you a web page at the end of the presentation that you can go to get started with a number of RDM resources at UNB. And it's full of help in terms of what we need to address and guidance, as you can see in the left-hand side, for how to address each one of the requirements with each one of those areas. Once you're done with the DMP, you can actually download it, submit it as part of a funding application, or you can just use it to sort of structure your own. DMP is not required, or rather the DMP Assistant is not required, but it is a very, very effective way to get a good overview of what's required for a good DMP. Data deposit is the last thing that we're going to need to worry about, and it's going to get rolled out after the tri-agencies have started to see research or institutional strategies. So it covers the deposit of metadata, data, and code, typically at the time of publication. If there is an article or a preprint that gets issued, they want to see the data made available at roughly the same time as that. The idea is to ensure safe storage, preservation, and curation of the data. One thing to make absolutely clear with this too is it's not an open data policy. The tri-agencies are not requiring that you make your data open and freely available, but they do try and encourage it wherever possible. So there may be intellectual property issues, there may be privacy issues that said, well, I can't really share this data as freely as I'd like. You can still deposit it, but we can make sure that the security is there in place that you don't need to worry about that getting shared unintentionally. And that'll be phased in starting the beginning of next year. There are a number of different resources you can look at for research repositories. Right here at UNB, we have our own research data repository, UNB Identifers. It's been available since 2018, and the adoption's been a little bit slow but steady, but we've got people in physics, in forestry, in kinesiology, within the libraries, and a few other groups that are already using it for data deposit. Got a number of different features that are important. Data citation, it issues, assigns and registers DOIs, basic usage statistics if you're wondering who's accessing your data, versioning, and it also has access control. So if you don't want to make it freely available, but would like to hear from requests from researchers who'd like to access it, that's also a feature that we can add in now. everything that gets deposited into UNB Dataverse is actually made part of, or at least the metadata is made part of, a national database called FRDR. It's the Federated Research Data Repository, Canada. It's a Canadian repository. And that data actually gets shared even further in an international repository called Open Air. So by sharing with UNB Dataverse, you're actually exponentially increasing the exposure to your research and your research data. You're very well supported, as I mentioned at the very beginning. We've got an RDM services team here at UNB that includes about a half a dozen librarians, including myself, and a couple of our assistant group that are here and available to give you a hand as it's needed. I mentioned that website. This is probably the best place at UNB for you to get started with any questions you have about RDM. There are links there both to the DMP Assistant and to the UNB Dataverse that are available for you. And if you want to reach out to us directly, you can visit that website that I mentioned, lib.unb.ca/RDM, or you can reach out to it by email, rdm.services@unb.ca.
So, hi everybody, I'm Richelle Witherspoon. I'm the health librarian in UNB Fredericton. And I'll be giving an introduction to systematic reviews, although that's actually a misnomer. We call them systematic reviews when we talk to people, when we advertise.
Share your screen.
Yep, I will share my screen. It's going to happen. I'm smarter. Oops. So I'm not joined. Nope.
You can join this one though. You can leave them muted and then just share from there.
Cool. PowerPoint. And going again. Good thing I planned an extra couple minutes. So we advertise using the word systematic reviews because that's what most people recognize as being the term for this type of research. But more accurately, this is an introduction to knowledge synthesis, which is a more inclusive heading that covers dozens of types of reviews that all share a set of core methodologies and do the same, or sort of serve the same basic purpose. And that in addition to systematic reviews, also include umbrella reviews, clinical guidelines, rapid reviews, scoping reviews, meta-analyses, and probably 30 or 40 more different varieties. So the purpose of a knowledge synthesis is to take all of the available evidence on a topic and, if there's enough of it, to draw robust conclusions that are less vulnerable to systemic flaws than other forms of research. Which begs the question, what are these systemic flaws and how does knowledge synthesis address it? And the answer is complicated, but all comes down to the problem of P, which is the probability that a study will falsely claim that something is true. And specifically, in the case of sort of its problem, is that P becomes inflated when research is done. So in theory, a single quantitative study will have a p-value or a probability of error of sort of anywhere between 0.001 and 5%, anywhere between 0.001% of the time and 5% of the time, depending on the field of study. But in practice, those numbers tend to be fairly inflated. So factors like sample contamination, publication bias, researcher error, p-hacking, selective reporting, and unknown or uncontrollable confounds change that p-value so that there's a higher level of error in our research than there statistically is meant to be, which makes it hard for us to trust single studies at any given moment. So what you really want is multiple converging points of evidence that lead to one answer to a problem. And that's what knowledge synthesis does. It looks at all of the existing literature on a topic, and when there's enough of it, it finds that point of convergence and brings you to that answer. And thereby minimizes the bias that are inherent in regular research. So that's what knowledge synthesis is and does. I'm going to take a moment to explain what it isn't. Because when I talk about knowledge synthesis, there's a lot of confusion just because the words knowledge synthesis have a basic meaning that is outside of the category in which I'm specifically referring to them as. So if I say knowledge synthesis, it sounds like something that researchers should be doing, which is synthesizing knowledge, or something that they do already, which is review the literature systematically. But knowledge syntheses themselves are a specific set of protocols and requirements, and sort of can be differentiated from other forms of research and other types of literature reviews by realizing that a literature review is part of the article, and knowledge synthesis is an article. So lit reviews are scans of the literature that place research in context. They discuss, argue, highlight, and support the hypothesis upon which the research is based. Lit reviews make an argument for the project being done. Knowledge syntheses are the project and have literature reviews that make arguments for them and place them in context. Knowledge syntheses also have their own specific methodology, and the method section describes that methodology and details all of the steps undertaken to minimize bias and increase comprehensiveness of the review. And they do not speculate, hypothesize, or argue. They only draw conclusions from what evidence is in front of them. They also differ from regular literature reviews in the fact that a single knowledge synthesis or systematic review can go through the peer review process as many as 3 times for a single article. Once at the protocol stage, once at the search development stage, and once again at final publication. So if you're curious as to whether systematic reviews and knowledge syntheses are right for you, I obviously can't answer that question for you, but a couple of things you might want to consider are, is the topic you're interested in very heavily researched? Because those topics lend themselves well to knowledge syntheses. Is there conflicting or confusing evidence in the research area that a knowledge synthesis might enable you to resolve? Are you trying to make a recommendation that would change policy or practice? Which again, those decisions should be made on multiple forms of evidence where knowledge synthesis comes in. Do you have a potential collaborator who has experience with knowledge syntheses and can walk you through the protocols and steps that are required by that type of research? And do you have enough time to complete a review? Because they're very time consuming, depending on the breadth and scope of your topic. So if you answered yes to most of those questions, chances are you could do a systematic review or a knowledge synthesis on your research topic, and it's entirely up to you as to whether you do that. The next question, though, is if you want to do a knowledge synthesis, what type do you want to do? So I mentioned previously that there are dozens of types of knowledge synthesis, including systematic, scoping, rapid, meta-analysis, umbrella, integrative, living, narrative, prognostic, and many, many more. And they're all very, very similar methodology. They differ slightly based on the type of evidence available or the type of question being asked. They do share that set core methodology. So when it comes to deciding what you want to do, it comes very much down to what your question is, what type of evidence is available. That's really the biggest part of it. So I am not going to try to go through all 48, 60 types, because honestly, I could list them or find a list of them regardless. But I will talk about sort of the 3 most prominent types and give you an idea of what those things contain. So scoping reviews tend to cover broad topics, and unlike other types of reviews, can actually answer multiple related questions, whereas most reviews deal with just one. And they tend to be used to identify the types of evidence in a field, to clarify key concepts in the literature, to examine research methodologies for a field or topic, to identify characteristics or factors related to a concept, or to identify knowledge gaps in a field. Scoping reviews are most often done as standalone research articles, but can also be done as part of a large grant application, or as a precursor to systematic reviews. Systematic reviews tend to be much more concrete and narrow in focus, and are typically used to confirm current practice or address variations in practice. They can be used to identify or inform future areas of research, to investigate conflicting research findings, and to produce statements to guide decision-making. The last really popular one is meta-analysis, and that's actually sort of a subset of systematic reviews, because meta-analyses are typically sort of an extra piece to a systematic review in which any quantitative research, the data from it is extracted and analyzed statistically, just add that extra bit of power to the sampling. Okay, so how can UNB libraries support you? So here at UNB, we offer three tiers of support. The first one is instruction and resources, which you'll find is sort of like what I'm doing now. I offer with a colleague in St. John a 3 to 5 day systematic review essential course that we offered last week, so it is finished for the year. But there are recordings from previous years on our website, and we do have a website that is very, very thorough and goes through, the steps, some of the research tools, how to do the searching. It talks about, different guidelines and reporting standards and links to things. So there's tons of information in there. And at the very end, I will show you where that website is and give you a quick tour of it if I don't run out of time first. So our second tier is consultation, where we typically meet with a student or a faculty member for 5 to 8 hours to address their research questions and to guide them through whatever part in the process they're stuck on. This is typically done in the research and searching phase, where my specific expertise and the expertise of my colleague in St. John come in the most valuable. Is how do you actually do that comprehensive search and report it for your paper? And our last tier of support is our collaboration phase, where myself or Alex Goudreau would become a partner in your team and would perform the search for you and report on it according to PRISMA guidelines. So let me talk a bit more about those resources we have for you. This is where I show you our beautiful, lovely website that we finished about 2 months ago. And I'm just going to hop in here. So really anything you need to know about systematic reviews or links to things or our service, you can find under the Research and Data tab on the website, under Knowledge Synthesis and Systematic Reviews. We have a Getting Started page that talks about what services we offer and what systematic reviews are. We have a Process and Searching page that deals with all the steps and pieces that go into building a search. We have tips, tools, and resources, which is largely links to other things. So PRISMA guidelines, reporting standards, hedges, filters, that kind of thing that will make more sense once you've gone through actually learning this stuff. As well as resources we've created in-house, so guides to databases and guides to disciplinary differences between systematic reviews. And finally, we have this workshops and training tool, which is great. So this has to be updated because boot camp's over for the year. But we do have recordings that we created post event last year that go through the same content we cover in our workshop every spring. That is totally available to you at any point. And with that, I'm aware that my time is running out. So thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, contact me. My emails are withers@unb.ca.
Okay, hi everyone, and good morning. My name is Jeannie Bale. I'm the liaison librarian for the Faculty Management in Renaissance College, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about using market intelligence. And just why, I know a lot of you are from different backgrounds, different faculties, different programs, and I'm just going to talk to you about the various ways that you can incorporate market intelligence into your work. And our sources cover a wide range of disciplines, so not just focused on business. Depending on what your focus is or your thesis topic, market intelligence sources can provide lots of really rich, high quality data that you can use and incorporate no matter which discipline you're based in. And also some of the resources I'm going to talk about, they're not just good for doing your own research, they're also good for career planning purposes. So some of the tools they give you access to company profiles, or even just if you're interested once you graduate from your program, going into a particular industry. So being able to research some of the major companies perhaps that are in that industry and just know more about it so that when you go for, or when you start your job hunting, you're well informed and you can really show that you've researched your company or topic you're interviewing with. And this is just an example here on the right-hand side. This was a master's thesis presentation that was given a few weeks ago. It was by a kinesiology student, and the student was talking about using video games in terms of intervention technique for health behavior change. And so talking a little bit about the e-gaming market and also esports. So I'm not sure if this student actually utilized some of our market intelligence sources, but it just goes to show how no matter what your discipline is, there's a sort of a way that you can incorporate these resources into your research. And so I'll be talking about just a couple of things during this talk. So the first one is how to differentiate between industry and market research, talking about how to locate the different databases via our library research guide, knowing where you can go to seek additional help after today's session. And then last, hopefully you'll be able to incorporate what you learned today into your program and beyond. So what exactly is market intelligence and how can the library provide you with some assistance and resources and services? So market intelligence is often used as a sort of a blanket term or umbrella term to describe two different types of research. So industry research, so that's, pretty self-explanatory. So research into a given industry, whether it's oil and gas or forestry or gaming. And then market research. And market research is really looking at the consumer side or future potential customers. And so our main focus is really going to be on the secondary research sources that are available via UNB libraries and different types of research. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these already, but primary research really is the collection of new data. And that's through either market surveys or doing field research. So research that's conducted by you versus secondary research that's gathering pre-existing information that could be useful to your purposes from already published sources. So with industry research, we're going to focus on data on companies that produce a similar product or service. And just a couple examples here. So this is a report, an industry report from PitchBook on the Internet of Things. Here's one from Frost & Sullivan on the global plastics and composites market. And here's another one. This is IBIS World, which has a specific Canadian module, research module, and this is cannabis production in Canada. And so industry reports tend to look at a lot of these different areas. So looking at the industry and which phase it currently is in. So whether it's a mature industry, and mature industry would be something like retail, or I already mentioned oil and gas, versus an emerging industry. So some emerging industries, of course, you have financial technology, Bitcoin, some of the Internet of Things, some of the reports that we just saw, And so that's a really important place to start in terms of looking at an industry. So what phase or sort of where it is in terms of development. Also want to look at the key players. So who has the biggest share of the market? And you can break that down in a lot of different ways. So is it by revenue, EBITDA? Is it by market cap? So lots of different ways you can determine sort of who the major players are within that industry. And then growth. So is the industry expanding? Is it shrinking? These are all really important questions that you want to ask when you're analyzing or interested in learning more about an industry. And then a big one is competitors. So who are companies within the particular space that you're looking at? And again, you can sort of break that apart in a lot of different ways. So you can look at comparable companies by size, strategy, geography is a really common one, especially since, here in the Atlantic region, oftentimes you have looking at other players within an industry within this particular market or region. And then trends. So what events are happening that would impact sales either now or in the future? And of course, a big one that we're experiencing right now is the pandemic. So a lot of our different resources have research that's focused specifically on how COVID or how the pandemic is affecting either a given market, industry, or the consumers. And here's an example. This is just a table of contents from that cannabis production report. So again, you can see, looking through just at a glance, a lot of the different topics that are covered, anywhere from sort of the industry, supply chain information, industry outlook. And again, this can be really interesting or informative when you're looking at your career, sort of future careers too. So look, if you're interested in, let's say, entering a particular industry, it would be useful to look at what the outlook is like for that industry and sort of prospects for future employment. Products and markets, also operating conditions, and a lot in terms of covering the competitive landscape. Also, I find a lot of the reports have additional resources, which can be really handy as well. And if you're unfamiliar sort of with the jargon or the terminology that's used, there's a glossary, as you can see in this report right here, to help familiarize yourself. So that's industry research. So contrasting that with market research, and that's research on targeted potential customers or consumers. And here are just a few reports to demonstrate. And this is really interesting because this is a really niche report. So you can do market research on just about everything and anything under the sun. So this is a market research study that was done by an MBA student at UPEI. It's on Aboriginal tourism and traditional basket weaving on PEI. So very, very narrow, very specific, a niche market there. And oftentimes when you do have a market that's so niche, you do end up doing some of that primary research where you're actually conducting surveys and interviewing and hosting focus groups. And here's just an example. This is from, it's from Insider Intelligence, but it's on the healthcare consumer. Here's a report from Statista. This is consumer trends for 2022. And then in terms of the areas that market research usually covers, again, sort of looking at the market size. So how big is the market in terms of potential customers? And sometimes, depending on what your product is or the service that's being offered, one thing especially investors look at when they're looking at companies is how scalable the company is. And in terms of scalability, you really want to look at the market size to determine future growth prospects. Demographics, so, what does the target customer look like? And a lot of, data points related to that in terms of age, gender, income. What we call psychographics, so that's data on preferences. So whether it's lifestyle or values, some of the things, oftentimes you see this related to different demographic groups like boomers or millennials or Gen Z. Geographics, so in terms of potential customers, what are some of the characteristics, urban versus rural, and then also similar to industry research, looking at the trends, so looking what's sort of coming down the pike in terms of forces shaping different habits and preferences. And this is just an example. This is from that Statista Consumer Trends report. And so you can see these are some of the trends in terms of, I think this was looking at Gen Z. So these are things that Gen Z really cares about in terms of sort of driving their purchasing, but sustainability and convenience, taking really sort of a great interest in health, personalization, so being able to customize different products. And it's really funny. So whenever I see students on campus and I notice that they're wearing like a really cool t-shirt or you know, like an old, I don't know, t-shirt from someplace like outside of Canada, when I've commented on how much I like their shirts, they've all replied that they've found them thrifting. So I can definitely say sustainability seems to be a value that they hold. Some examples of industry and market data. This was from the Maritime Edit, which is a publication coming out of New Brunswick. So these are just, there was an article about a wedding planner, and these are just quotes that were taken from the article. So you can see here, citing the source, the knot, right? So a wedding planning website predicts an estimated 2.6 million weddings will happen in the US alone for 2022. So this is a really good, this quote right here is a really good example of industry data versus market research with the millennial values being different. Couples want to travel, talking about how they're not prioritizing big expensive weddings anymore, really into low waste and sustainability. That would be a really good example of incorporating market research into this particular article. So these are just some of the different resources that we have access to through UNB libraries. And you can find these different resources on the Entrepreneurship Research Guide. So if you just click on Entrepreneurship, and if you look on the left-hand side, there's a Market Research Guide. So you can just select that and go to Secondary Research up at the top. And you'll find a list of many of the different resources that are available. And with lots of our resources, oftentimes they offer more than one type of research, right? So this is a really good sort of concept map that I stole from UBC, but you can see we're with the arrows, those are the sources, the databases that we have access to through UNB libraries. But you can see oftentimes they provide more than one type of report or information. So for example, with Business Source Complete, you can get articles and news. Passport, you can get overviews, company overviews, also find information on consumers. So a lot of these databases provide more than just one type of information. You can get lots of different information from them. And I'll just end by saying that we have, with these different resources, we have academic licenses, and the academic licensing terms are quite clear in terms of access. So access is limited only to current students, faculty, and staff at UNB. And the information in the databases is really for non-commercial purposes only. So you cannot, unfortunately, share these reports with people outside of UNB. And of course, as you probably know, any information that's used or utilized has to be cited. And in terms of the, so we pay, I would say, quite a bit to acquire these resources. And so just so you can better understand sort of the value of what we're getting from our subscriptions, this is a report here on the global pet food ingredients market. And if you were to purchase this report, the retail cost would be nearly $5,000 in USD. So the retail costs are quite high to acquire, and when we acquire these resources, our main goal is to make sure that you're using them and that we want to keep offering these databases. So it's really important that you know about all of these resources available to you and that you're able to utilize them. And with that, I think that's all that I wanted to share this morning. So thank you so much for attending my talk. And this is my contact information. And there's also contact information for me located on the Entrepreneurship Research Guide. So thanks, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I think we're ready to go on a bit of a tour. So as you can tell, we've been in the data visualization lab, which is a large format wall that enables presentations and collaborations anywhere where Canvas with significant real estate might come into play or be handy. So things like Storymaps and doing text data mining, it's great to be able to use a large screen. But I've also seen students in here working on various other types of projects, and it's just an open space and a pretty decent spot to do some hybrid or in-person presentations. A particularly popular installation that is beginning to take the place of computer labs that we've seen are monitors that students can plug their own laptops into so that they have a dual monitor installation while they're in here. And of course, we're in summertime, so it's not very busy now, but once courses are in session, this is probably the most popular spot in the library. Over here, we have our studio spaces. This will give you a bit of a different perspective on the Lightboard studio. So when I was filming, I was over on this side of the board and looking into a monitor. Basically, what you can see is it is just a piece of glass lit up with lights around it. And then what I'm looking at, I would see my team's meeting on one monitor. It's off now. And then what folks see virtually is on the left monitor. Just behind over here, there's a 12 workstation digital scholarship hub, which has high powered PCs and some specialized software. Next to the Lightboard studio, we have the audio studio. And so this is a space where students can come and either record the voiceovers for a video that they're working on, or if you're working on a podcast, it can be done in here. There's specialized software, including Ableton Live, and then more popular entry-level software like Audacity. So there's a decent microphone. We've got some soundproofing happening. And we've also been advising students on podcasts and audio types of projects that they're interested in, whether they're on campus in Fredericton or not. The expertise and the advice is available to everyone. So we're going to drop in briefly into our fabrication lab. So this is a makerspace in the library here, and it's the second node in UNB's makerspace ecosphere, in the engineering library. Oh, and here comes our facilitator out of the washroom, DJ. Just in time, as if on cue. We're just doing a quick tour virtually. So this is a space that includes a number of technology, including the ever popular 3D printers behind here. But we also have a sewing machine, a Cricut maker. There are various tools, paint, and a growing number of materials and tools based on what students have been interested in using, whether just for a creative outlet, something apart from the courses that they're working on, or else something that's incorporated into a project that they might be working on with some sort of material aspect, or else, well, whatever the case. Let's say you're working on an entrepreneurial idea and you'd like to develop some promotional materials or a prototype for a product or concept that you're working on. This is a space where you have access to the tools and a very open, friendly, helpful environment and staff to give you a hand with tips, and sometimes they're learning from you as well. And this is open to everybody on campus. So you might remember, for those of you who were in Christine Lovelace's session, she was mentioning the Peter Paul font, and we actually have an exhibit of Peter Paul materials. He was very important in continuing to preserve the Wolastoqey language here in New Brunswick. And we're actually working with a student who's developing some manipulatives in the fabrication lab for elementary school students in the province to learn the Wolastoqey language. And so we've moved from the 20th century here with this exhibit to using the fabrication lab in a similar capacity and for similar aims on into the 21st century. A few items that have been printed in the fabrication lab, including a floor plan of the Research Commons. So there are various meeting rooms, seminar rooms, and group study rooms everywhere that include whiteboards as well as an LCD that you can port to via AirMedia or HDMI. A few students studying. For those of you who weren't in this room, this is the Innovation Hub, and this is where the concurrent sessions were happening in the other team meeting. And so, Mattia, would you the windows there? Because it's such a nice view of the campus from here. For those of you who haven't visited UNB Fredericton, it sits halfway up the Wolastoqey River Valley, or the St. John River, here in Fredericton. And so from the library, we can see that spring is in full swing here, as the rains of a couple of weeks ago have given way to sunshine that's really bringing out the budding leaves and flowers. So this is a nice room for people to come and collaborate. They can be presenting up front potentially, and then doing breakouts in the back of the room here. The whiteboards in particular have been probably the lowest phi technology on the floor and the most popular. So we have these mobile whiteboards that students can use and move around the space, particularly during exams. They were used for all sorts of purposes, including giving yourself a little bit of privacy here and there. So basically what we're doing right now is going counterclockwise around the perimeter of the floor. Earlier, Leah, in our sessions, in speaking about Storymaps, was talking about Siobhan Hanratty, whose office is here, and also manages and makes considerable use of a large format scanner and printer. We've got some quiet study space here that's designated specifically for that purpose, and otherwise, when semesters are in full swing, this can be a bit of a boisterous place on this floor, a bit of a noise-friendly enclave. So there's some open seating areas that are just outside of our 10 group study rooms on this floor. This has been one of the funnest things happening on the floor over the past academic year. A whiteboard that's been used to survey students on various topics, as well as just to elicit a little bit of participation and a sense of community where people can contribute to different questions, whether it's what your favorite restaurant is in town, or what your plans are for holidays, those sorts of things, what your favorite with one another, and to develop mementos of the year and the experience that people have shared. Over here to the left is our event space, which, similar to the data visualization lab, has a glass partition that of 8-foot screens that drop for projectors. And so some events and classes have happened here, whether contained to the space or opening out. And so, for example, in a couple of weeks, we will be hosting the Atlantic Canada Studies Conference, and this will be one of the spaces that they're using for various presentations throughout that. Similar to the large whiteboard, in a way, is one of our signature installations here and engagement pieces known as Ping Pong Perspectives. So we've been asking students questions throughout the year that they get to weigh in with by dropping actually it's a beer pong ball, but we call it ping pong, into one of the options that are available. So the question right now is, what is your favorite place in the Research Commons? So this time of year, they're fairly innocuous questions, but it also gives us a chance to see what people are thinking about what we're doing, while also serving the dual, introducing people to data visualization, where they might not have been thinking about the various ways that visualizing data can come in handy in their sorts of research. So what we've been doing at the end of every week after a question, and it's summer, there's barely anybody here now, but throughout the academic year, you see these just filling up. It gives kind of a colorful display of people's particular preferences and where they're weighing in on questions. And then we've been using a piece of software called Tableau to develop on the board that we were presenting on earlier, graphic depictions of the implications of folks' results and weighing in on that. So it's been an opportunity to both gauge people's opinions and preferences on a number of questions, and then show them what data visualization can look like, which is another area that we have expertise in software, provide guidance in using, as well as the actual technologies. For graduate students on site, we actually have a graduate lounge. And so this is a place where grad students can come and flash their U-card, or if they are so equipped with cyborg capabilities, they can use that. And we'll hold the door for the camera person here. And so basically there's a couple of different rooms, one that's a bit more of a quiet study lounge, very quiet today, with lockers that can be signed out. And we won't disturb people on this side, but there is another lounge here that has a kitchenette, as well as off of it a small room for folks that need some privacy in conducting digital meetings. It has a PC with a webcam or interviews and that sort of thing. So it's a spot where on-site graduate students here can grab a locker for a semester, and also if they want to avail themselves with the kitchenette or meet with some friends, then it's a space dedicated just to that. And so now we have kind of the long view here. The long view here of the
data visualization lab. We can see Eden over here, who has been helpfully helping out with chat and making sure that everything is working. And we also have an information kiosk where Eden and others pitch in to help people with any questions that they might have. And so that's the tour. I am, as always, Marc Bragdon, and on the camera today is Mattia Fonzo, who's the manager of the space. We will be providing, along with the information that Jamie mentioned and the questions and whatnot, some context and follow-up related to the sessions that you've seen today, including how potentially you could book some of the spaces physically, as well as contact people, because, I mean, let's face it, most of the work that we've been doing, regardless of whether we have these particular spaces or not, has been virtual, and that is going to continue into the future, foreseeable or otherwise. Thanks a lot for your participation today, and look forward to getting to know some of you online and in person, moving into the summer and beyond.